Hearing will come to order. Today, the committee will discuss the growing number of ransomware attacks, which are increasingly disrupting our economy and our lives. Today's hearing is the first ever full committee hearing of the Judiciary Committee on Ransomware. Marks the first congressional testimony this year by the Justice Department and FBI on this threat. Majority Leader Schumer asked Senate committees to review how the agencies under their jurisdiction are responding to the ransomware threat. Ranking Member Grassley also requested today's hearing, and we consulted with his staff on choosing the witness panel. We'll hear from a panel of experts from the Department of Justice, the FBI, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, aka CISA, I believe, and the Secret Service. They will discuss the scope of the threat and what the agencies are doing to prevent it. They'll also provide guidance on best practices on how businesses and organizations can protect themselves. Before we get started, I'd like to turn to a brief video that gives us a sense of the ransomware threat.
Warning. Warning. Security breach. Security breach.
Attacks have increased in both scope and sophistication in the last year.
Ransomware encrypts a computer network's data to hold it hostage and then will only give the digital decryption key to unlock it for a price.
The average payment climbed from a few $1,000s in 2018 to more than $230,000.
A ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline forced the 5,500-mile pipeline to shut down for 6 days, spurring a run on gasoline along parts of the East Coast.
Now they're attacking our meat supply.
JBS says units in Australia and North America were hit over the weekend by what the company is calling an organized cyber attack on its information system.
Hospitals are being targeted by hackers.
Ransomware attacks are rampant, freezing computer systems for everything from a meat processor to hospitals and even schools.
These attacks are increasing in frequency, victim losses are skyrocketing, and hackers are shifting their targets away from data-rich companies to providers of key public needs.
In 2020, professional and public service and manufacturing were the three industries that were hit the hardest, followed closely by healthcare, technology, and finance. A ransomware attack may have also claimed its first life after taking a hospital offline.
Ransomware is the #1 cybersecurity threat that we all face today.
Ransomware and digital extortion pose a national security and an economic security threat to the United States.
Warning. Warning. Security breach.
It's about more than money and inconvenience. The harm of ransomware can affect real lives. An example, on October 28th of last year, an oncology nurse named Colleen Cargill was preparing a patient for a chemotherapy infusion when she made an unsettling discovery. She couldn't log into her computer. Every time she typed in her credentials, the system would boot her out. She tried logging in from a backup computer. That didn't work either. Instead, she was greeted by a red circle with a diagonal line drawn through it. At that moment, she realized that her hospital, the largest medical system in the state of Vermont, had been infiltrated. The network had been shut down. The hackers behind the attack were holding the hospital's data hostage, which meant Colleen and her colleagues couldn't access patient data for their cancer patients. They had to try to recreate patient chemotherapy protocols from memory and copies of old faxes. The hospital's electronic medical system would remain offline for nearly a month. Colleen told the New York Times those weeks were the worst of her life, and she's not alone. Colleen and her patients are just a few of the many Americans who've been victimized by ransomware attacks. Nearly every organization and industry is vulnerable, from hospitals, school districts, local governments, nonprofits, businesses large and small. Here's how it works. Hackers break into your computer system, lock up your data, demand a ransom payment, often through untraceable cryptocurrency for the return of the data. Though any person or entity can be targeted in a ransomware attack, it's been estimated that small businesses make up over half of the victims. And these attacks can have permanent damage. Last year, it took an average of 9 months for a business to fully recover from a ransomware attack. Even the biggest and most profitable companies in the world are at risk. Earlier this year, we remember the cybercrime sentiment knocking out Colonial Pipeline, the largest pipeline operator in the United States. That shutdown sparked a nationwide panic that had customers waiting in line at gas stations for hours, and the incident brought the ransomware attack into plain view. They're becoming more frequent, more destructive, and the tools needed to commit them are easily accessible. Last year, global ransom payments reached $350 million. A recent New Yorker piece talked about the average payment for ransomware. 2018, average payment $7,000. 2019, $41,000. 2020, somewhere between $200,000 and $300,000. In recent months, barely a day has gone by without news of a ransomware attack. By one estimate, American businesses, healthcare facilities, and organizations and state and local governments are projected to endure more than 65,000 ransomware attacks this year alone. This is a criminal business model that is spreading. If someone wants to commit an attack, they can easily purchase or lease ready-use ransomware. According to one expert, it's, quote, way too easy to get into this. Just hire it out. There's been an incredible commoditization of the entire process. And I'm concerned as well that ransomware criminals often operate with impunity in Russia and other nations. Those nations are unwilling to prosecute or pursue the evildoers. We need to attack this new reality. We need new protocols for preventing and responding to. The president understands it. His administration is taking a whole-of-government approach to prevent, deter, and respond. They recently launched a cross-government task force to coordinate offensive and defensive measures against these attacks and to help businesses. The administration also launched StopRansomware.gov, a new website that provides one central location for ransomware resources. These efforts are welcome because when it comes to ransomware, it's not just our money that's at stake. It's sensitive information, a personal sense of security, and truthfully, our nation's security. It's a critical challenge. This committee will do its part to meet it, starting with today's hearing. Now I turn to my friend and ranking member, Chuck Grassley.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, for holding this hearing. I thank you for agreeing. I better turn this off. I thank you for agreeing to hold this hearing, an important bipartisan hearing on a problem of ransomware. Hear about it every day. I've appreciated working with you on this subject and look forward to continuing to work if we decide that legislation is necessary. The threat that we face from ransomware is increasing. Criminal actors are using techniques like phishing emails to gain access to data of business, nonprofit, or a government. The criminal actors then lock the data down and demand a large ransom. Usually very difficult to trace virtual currency like Bitcoin is used to pay for it. Yet paying a ransom is no guarantee that the victim will have their data returned and that they will not be victimized again and asked to pay yet another ransom. Earlier this year, we had FBI Director Chris Wray compared the challenge of fighting ransomware to those that we face after 9/11. Estimates on the amount of ransom paid in 2020 ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars. Ransomware has targeted schools, local governments, and during this pandemic, can you believe it, even hospitals and healthcare providers. In May, 2 massive ransomware attacks hit a critical supply of gas, the Colonial Pipeline, and a major supplier of meat, the JBS slaughtering operation. These events created very disturbing questions about the security of our supply of essential goods like fuels and food. Since that time, I've received questions from many Iowans about what we can do as a nation and as individuals to fight the threat of ransomware. This hearing will help us answer those questions. Ransomware does not just affect the deeper pockets of large companies like Colonial Pipeline and JBS. An estimated 3 out of every 4 victims of ransomware is a small business. Small businesses already operate on thin margins, and many have been pushed to a brink by the pandemic. I'm glad that we'll be hearing today what government agencies like cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency at the Department of Homeland Security can do to help small business owners to practice good cyber protection to avoid ransomware attacks. We will also be hearing which investigators like FBI and the Secret Service can do for those who have been victimized. Ransomware often originates from countries with permissive law enforcement environments that allow these cyber criminals to flourish. So-called ransomware as a service is a business model. Can you believe that? Employed by criminal networks such as DarkSide and Reveal. DarkSide and Reveal are behind many of the recent attacks. These criminal organizations work like illicit software providers, creating ransomware and leasing it to other criminal actors like known as affiliate profits. We will be hearing from the Department of Justice how these criminal actors can be targeted and punished. The situation would be dire enough if ransomware was used only by sophisticated criminal actors in countries unwilling to help bring them to justice. However, just last week, the Biden administration and many countries, which are allies of the United States, formally blamed China for a massive hack of Microsoft Exchange email servers. Hackers operating under the umbrella of China's own Ministry of State Security appear to have used the hack to engage in ransomware schemes for their own profit. They will have extorted millions in ransom from our own U.S. victims. I have spoken many times on the dangers of cyber attacks, theft of intellectual property, and other aggressive behavior by China. I fear that ransomware will be a new method used by the Chinese Communist Party against Americans, and I will be pursuing opportunities to combat that danger. I look forward to hearing the testimony about what the executive branch agencies are doing to fight ransomware and what we as a country can do. And I thank all of our witnesses for attending.
Thanks, Senator Grassley. Senator Feinstein asked to say a few words.
Yeah, just a brief a comment, Mr. Chairman. I've been on this committee a long time. It's really not often that you pick up your binder and something in it immediately alerts you. And ransomware immediately alerts me to a real problem. We've had 2,474 complaints related to them presented to the FBI. And all I want to say is that I think we've got to take this very seriously and pass some legislation to deal with it.
Thank you, Senator. I want to thank this panel of four witnesses. We have extraordinary career federal employees who are involved in pursuing this issue. Richard Downing served since 2015 as a Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division in the Department of Justice. He oversees the work of the Criminal Division's Computer Crime and Intellectual Property Section, Child Exploitation and Obscenity Section. Brian Vorndren is appointed Assistant Director for the FBI Cyber Division in March, previously Deputy Assistant Director of Criminal Investigations, the Assistant Special Agent in charge of cyber and counterintelligence programs in Baltimore. Excuse me. Eric Goldstein, appointed in February as the Executive Assistant Director for Cybersecurity at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency within the Department of Homeland Security. And finally, Jeremy Sheridan, appointed in April as the Assistant Director of the Office of Investigations at the United States Secret Service. Each witness will have 5 minutes, and then there'll be follow-up questions asked for 5 minutes by each member of the panel. We start this off with swearing in the witnesses. I ask you all, please rise. Raise your right hand. Do you affirm the testimony you're about to give before the committee to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Mr. Downing, you're first up.
Good morning, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify about the Department of Justice's efforts against ransomware. I'd like to emphasize three themes from my statement for the record. First, ransomware is a very serious problem, but it is also a tough problem to solve. Second, the department has had some recent successes in addressing that problem, but we are redoubling our efforts. And third, Congress can help. The ransomware attacks over the past months have made it very clear that ransomware is a serious threat to our public safety and our national and economic security. It has been used to attack governments, police departments, and even hospitals during the pandemic. The number of attacks and the size of demands has skyrocketed in the last year. Some demands now exceed $50 million. Even worse, many actors now steal information from victims, like trade secrets or client files, and release that information on the internet if the ransom is not paid. But a number of factors make it hard to solve this problem in the way that we might normally address a crime problem. Ransomware attacks are at our borders. Investigators often need to make requests for assistance to foreign law enforcement agencies to gather evidence in other countries, a process that can be cumbersome and time-consuming. And countries like Russia have refused to extradite offenders living within their borders or prosecute them themselves. To make matters worse, many of these crimes involve anonymizing technologies, such as the Tor network and anonymity-enhanced cryptocurrencies, making it hard to identify perpetrators. Finally, investigations are hindered because many victim companies choose not to report to federal authorities. I'll touch on this more in a moment. Despite these difficulties, we have had some recent successes, and we're keenly focused on doing more. In May, most of the ransom paid by the Colonial Pipeline was recovered. In January, the United States, Canada, and Bulgaria disrupted NetWalker, a ransomware variant that was used to attack hospitals during the pandemic. And also in January, the department and international partners disrupted Emotet, a botnet that was used to send ransomware to victim computers. But we are not resting on these laurels. Department leadership created a ransomware and digital exploitation task force to focus attention on this problem. This task force will help to make sure that the department is doing all it can to arrest offenders and disrupt their crimes, as well as to assure robust coordination with partners across the federal government and within the private sector. And it is a key part of what must be a whole-of-government solution. We are committed to working with partner agencies across the executive branch to address the threat. So what can Congress do to help? First and foremost, we face a gap in reporting from victims. Without prompt reporting, investigative opportunities are lost. Our ability to assist other victims facing the same attacks is degraded. And the government and Congress does not have a full picture of the threat facing American companies. Congress should enact legislation to require victims to report. We recommend that a reporting requirement include ransomware attacks, critical infrastructure attacks, and other high-impact breaches. We think reports should be prompt and should include details about any ransom demand or payment. Legislation should designate a single point where victims can file reports with immediate sharing to all relevant federal agencies. And victims should not be worse off for helping the government. They should maintain whatever legal privilege they had on that information prior to sharing the information. Finally, we would ask Congress to enact legislation that would help the department disrupt ransomware and mass hacking. This legislation would give courts the authority to enjoin ransomware and botnets affecting 100 or more computers. Our proposal also contains other helpful amendments that would enhance our ability to charge offenders and disrupt attacks. I want to thank the committee again for providing me the opportunity to discuss these important issues, and I'm happy to answer your questions when that time comes. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Downing. Mr. Vorndran?
Good morning, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of this committee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here to represent the FBI in our cyber program and to sit with our federal partners as a unified front against this growing ransomware threat in the country. As you know, this hearing comes at an important time. Your title says it all. As the cyber community learns from past incidents and works to ensure all the nation's people, companies, and levels of government are protected from future ransomware attacks. At the FBI, we've been sounding the alarm on ransomware for some time now, and the 5-year cyber strategy Director Wray announced last year gives us a roadmap to continue to mitigate this threat. Using this strategy, our goal is to not only pursue our own actions, but also work seamlessly with our domestic and international partners to defend our networks, attribute malicious activity, sanction bad behavior, and take the fight to our adversaries overseas. Our success relies on our ability together to impose risk and consequences on malicious cyber actors and to do so through joint operations sequenced for maximum durable impact. We have to target the entire criminal ecosystem, including malware developers, money launderers, and shady infrastructure providers, and bring together the cybersecurity firms, service providers, and victims in this common fight. 2 successes made possible by our cyber strategy were the recent Emotet and NetWalker disruptions, as mentioned by Mr. Downing. In January, in coordination with the intelligence community, an unprecedented number of foreign law enforcement partners in the private sector, we disrupted Emotet, one of the longest-lasting, costly, and sophisticated cybercrime services. In the 9 months leading up to the takedown, it's estimated Emotet caused hundreds of millions of dollars in damage and infected more than 1.6 million computers. That same month, we also worked with international partners to disrupt the NetWalker ransomware variant, which had been responsible for impacting numerous victim companies, municipalities, and schools. As part of that operation, we obtained federal charges, a subject was arrested, and we seized nearly $27.5 million in cryptocurrency. Today, you'll hear from 4 agencies working together on the front lines of this fight, but ransomware has become so widespread, it can't be solved by federal action alone. We need Congress and the public to assist. We need a federal cyber incident reporting standard for breaches that pose significant risks, because inconsistent voluntary reporting is simply not enough. We need affected entities to report to the federal government as promptly as possible and within a defined time frame, because we must act swiftly. And we need ransomware reports to include all information about the ransom demand and any potential ransom payment information, because we can't let cyber criminals extort victims without repercussions. This may scare some folks out there. We understand why you may be hesitant to report an attack and to work with law enforcement. We do get that. But I want you to know we're here to help you. As the FBI does with all victims we counter in our work, we aim to inform, support, and assist ransomware victims in navigating the aftermath of crime and the criminal justice process with dignity and resilience. We want to empower victims of cybercrime because by working with law enforcement, you move us closer to the day when the people who victimized you can't strike again. When we receive information from you, we're going to use it to help limit damage to you and others, to improve our national security, and to keep others from being victimized. When victims work with us, everybody wins except the bad guys. You all have constituents who have been hurt by ransomware, and I had personal experience with this issue as an FBI special agent in charge. When I was in New Orleans in 2019, the Louisiana Governor's Office declared 2 separate states of emergency following a wave of ransomware attacks against school districts across the state and government agencies. As a father of school-aged children, this hits home. We're here today to inform you, your constituents, and the American public about ransomware, to make sure everyone knows this is a whole of government, but perhaps more importantly, a whole of society issue, and to make it clear what people can do to protect themselves and how to respond if they unfortunately become a victim. So again, thank you for inviting us to address this important topic, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Bondren. Mr. Goldstein.
Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, members of the committee, thank you for the chance to speak with you today on behalf of CISA and about this urgent threat. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your opening video, which really reflects the urgency of this issue and the fact that ransomware intrusions can now impact the national critical functions upon which American families, businesses, and all levels of government depend. As the lead agency for civilian cybersecurity, CISA plays a key role in managing the risk of ransomware. But we don't do it alone. One theme today will be that this is truly a whole of government and whole of nation effort in which all agencies are aligned toward a shared outcome, reducing the prevalence and impact of ransomware intrusions affecting our country. Many of CISA's efforts to mitigate ransomware are focused on ensuring that all organizations in this country, big and small, across sectors, understand three key points. The first is that ransomware intrusions can affect any organization, from a small business to a Fortune 100 corporation. The second is that ransomware intrusions can cause prolonged downtime, significant financial implications, and potential impacts to public health and safety. And the third is that investing in cybersecurity best practices has been shown to be demonstrably effective in reducing the prevalence and impact of these intrusions. To this latter point, Chairman, as you mentioned, just last week, CISA and our partners across the interagency, including the FBI and the Secret Service, launched StopRansomware.gov, a new whole-of-government website intended to provide organizations across the country with access to resources, to intrusions, and report them when they occur. And this website builds upon our earlier campaigns on this topic, including our Secretary's Ransomware Sprint and our earlier Reduce the Risk of Ransomware campaign. We also offer a variety of no-cost voluntary services that businesses around the country can take advantage of to help secure their networks and identify risks. In particular, I'll call out our Ransomware Readiness Assessment, which is a self-assessment tool that helps organizations identify their preparedness for responding to and managing a ransomware intrusion. But going forward, it is very clear that we, as a government and as a nation, need to do more to address ransomware intrusions and the broader cybersecurity risks we face. The stakes are simply too high. First, CISA and our partners across government must gain increased visibility into cybersecurity intrusions and threats affecting our nation's businesses and state, local, tribal, and territorial entities. Without this visibility, we are unable to effectively share information, develop timely alerts, help victims, and understand impacts of these intrusions to the national critical functions upon which we all depend. As my colleagues have noted, we look forward to working with Congress on incident reporting legislation that will significantly increase the volume of incidents that are reported to CISA and our government partners today to ensure that we can act with urgency to render assistance and understand the breadth of these campaigns affecting American companies. Second, we must continue to invest in and mature our voluntary partnerships with the private sector and our state and local partners across the country. Over the past several months, the interagency has worked in collaboration with the private sector to focus on cyber defense against known ransomware campaigns. And going forward, we are shortly launching our new cyber defense collaboration effort, as established by last year's NDAA, to formalize and bring together the private sector and government in a way that will allow us to exercise the best of the private sector and government in managing these risks. And lastly, we must recognize that at least in the near term, we cannot prevent all intrusions and must drive a focus on resilience and functional continuity to ensure that intrusions don't impact the critical functions upon which Americans depend. To this end, the Cyber Response and Recovery Fund, an effort recommended by the Cyberspace Solarium Commission and recently passed by the Senate, would provide CISA with additional resources and capacity to respond rapidly to catastrophic cyber incidents. Our nation is facing unprecedented risk from these kind of intrusions. CISA and our partners across the agency are deeply focused on this risk, and we all must continue to redouble this focus, working with the private sector, with our state, local, tribal, and territorial partners, and with Congress to make sure that we are minimizing risks to our people, to our businesses, and to our government. Thank you again for the chance to be here, and I very much look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Mr. Goldstein. Mr. Sheridan.
Good morning, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of this committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify on the threat of ransomware, the growing risks it poses to the American people, and the work of the U.S. Secret Service and our partners to hold criminal actors accountable. In my role as the Assistant Director of Investigations, I lead our more than 160 global field offices and direct our network of cyber fraud task forces. I work to ensure that we are effectively detecting and arresting those actors engaging in the criminal violations we are authorized to investigate, while fully supporting our diverse protective requirements across the world. The U.S. Secret Service is a relatively small, specialized agency within the broader federal law enforcement community. Our investigative expertise, capabilities, and statutory authorities are all focused on our mission to protect America's financial infrastructure and payment systems from criminal abuse. The Secret Service's distinct focus allows us to keep pace with rapid changes in the financial sector and with the criminal schemes seeking to exploit those changes. Indeed, the Secret Service has been conducting investigations of cybercrime since well before they were even called cybercrimes. Our approach has remained consistent over the decades. By pursuing illicit proceeds, developing detailed evidence on transnational cybercrime networks, and by working with our partners around the globe, we have brought to justice some of the world's most infamous cybercriminals, including many who are thought to be beyond the reach of law enforcement. In particular, we have prioritized the investigation of key enablers of cybercrime, such as illicit digital money platforms, dark web forums, and other services that enable transnational cybercriminal activities like the use of ransomware. Our long investigative tradition, focused specifically on financial crimes, leads us to view today's ransomware crisis through a historical lens, one driven by three complex and interrelated factors. First, the swelling profitability of these attacks, largely as the result of the growth of cryptocurrency. Second, the inadequate security systems connected to the internet. And third, perhaps most importantly, the maturation of a cybercriminal ecosystem that we have not sufficiently suppressed and is now engaged in increasingly brazen attacks. It does us no service to sugarcoat the reality of today's situation. Cybercriminal networks are emboldening and expanding. Today, ransomware is menacing our economy and our homeland security. Cybercriminals are making more money and doing more harm to our society than ever before. They are creating a highly destabilizing force in international relations and risking unintended escalation as states look to consider their response options. To reiterate what my colleagues here today have all emphasized, there's no silver bullet for addressing the ransomware threat or our mounting cybersecurity risks. But federal law enforcement can act in meaningful ways to improve the current situation. First, we must reduce the profitability of ransomware campaigns by improving our ability to detect and interdict cybercrime proceeds. This will require a significant investment in tools, training, and personnel at home, as well as strengthened partnerships overseas. Second, we must work with technology companies and internet users to improve their defenses and resilience against cyber threats. And third, we must dramatically intensify our national and international efforts to investigate, arrest, and prosecute those engaged in transnational cybercrimes, including ransomware. Absent these combined efforts, I anticipate an increase in both the severity and frequency of highly disruptive ransomware attacks that will make recent incidents seem rather mild by comparison. This should not be a political or geopolitical debate. Ransomware is endangering us all. Criminals are not targeting just big businesses, but schools, city governments, local police departments, and other services upon which the American people depend. Progress is possible. The Secret Service's successful investigations of the recent ransomware attacks on the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department and the City of Atlanta show that we can hold criminals accountable. Our March 2020 alert, which notified dozens of U.S. hospitals and healthcare providers of criminal presence in their networks, potentially preventing numerous ransomware attacks, shows the ways that proactive information sharing can tangibly reduce cybersecurity risk. However, going forward, meaningful gains will require a renewed commitment on the part of the international community to make it clear that such destructive criminal activities are unacceptable in a civilized world. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today and for your continued support of the U.S. Secret Service. I look forward to working closely with this committee and with other members of Congress on our shared priorities and welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sheridan. Mr. Downing, on June 7th, the Department of Justice announced that it seized $2.3 million in cryptocurrency paid to the hackers behind the May ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline. The criminal syndicate named DarkSide demanded a ransom in Bitcoins, and Colonial Pipeline paid it. According to the DOJ press release, law enforcement was able to review the Bitcoin public ledger, track transfers of Bitcoin, and identify $2.3 million in proceeds from these ransom payments. It seems, for lack of a better reference, that cryptocurrency and Bitcoins are the coin of the realm when it comes to this ransomware. What can we do? What specific laws should we enact in the United States to be responsive to this and diminish the role of cryptocurrency?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the question. I agree completely that the cryptocurrency has unfortunately fueled this rise of crime. It has two key aspects to it. It's often anonymous, and it is non-reversible. That is, once it's passed to the criminals, it's very difficult to claw it back. We do not have a current proposal to enhance our authority to track or to interdict these kinds of things, but it's something that's very much under consideration. We definitely see this as an increased problem and look to the laws that we already have on the books, like the Bank Secrecy Act, to enforce the rules and regulations that are already applying to cryptocurrency exchanges and other actors in this space.
That's exactly the point. We enacted laws so that the transfer of certain amounts really required disclosures to the government so we could monitor those. It's not a perfect system by any means, but it would seem that the Bitcoin and cryptocurrency need to be subject to some sort of review, surveillance, or regulation as well. Let me ask you another question to the panel, and maybe someone else would like to take it on. There was an article on June 7th in the New Yorker entitled "The Go-Between" by Rachel Monroe. It talked about the similarities between kidnapping, and she wrote that about 3/4 of Fortune 500 companies eventually invested in kidnap and ransom insurance. There was some discomfort in the industry that they were funneling money to the mafia, terrorist groups, and criminal gangs, but by establishing some sort of a method to this madness, they were able to recover 97% of the kidnap victims without harm. Now, several countries went an extra step, particularly Italy, Colombia, and the United Kingdom banned kidnap and ransom insurance. And the argument was made in this article that really had a negative impact. Countries that banned kidnap insurance drove negotiations underground. Now we're dealing in a world of cyber insurance, and those who are trying to buy some protection through the insurance mechanism for their vulnerability. Is there any value to looking at the kidnapping experience and banning that insurance and deciding whether that has any beneficial aspects to it?
Sir, I can start the conversation on that question. When we go back several years, it's at least our belief and understanding from public records that the insurance industry really started within cyber so that we could drive better cyber hygiene. And, I think the question that we should all be asking ourselves is that what has actually happened? Has the implementation of cybersecurity insurance driven better cyber hygiene? And so from our perspective with dealing with target entities or victims, when we talk with them, the insurance availability is a big piece of their decision calculus about whether they do or don't pay. And my opinion would be that within the interagency, there's ongoing conversations about the value or lack thereof insurance, and I think it's probably a conversation that should be had within this committee as well.
Well, it certainly is an important one, and I suppose I can argue both sides. I'm glad to see you're making a review of it at this point. It seems to me it facilitates the payment in these circumstances, and it may set up the mechanism that they referred to with kidnap insurance. I don't know. What is your impression? Are there special negotiators in this ransomware world that try to diminish the amounts that are being paid with any effect?
There are special negotiators in this space for private sector companies that take on the negotiations with the cyber adversaries that are overseas. And from our conversations with people making decisions in companies about whether to pay or not to pay, we can assure you that the insurance availability or lack thereof becomes a relevant component of their decision making.
Thank you. Senator Grassley?
Yeah, Mr. Goldstein, I'm going to start with you. I understand that CISA helps businesses large and small in preventing ransomware attacks. This is partially through a recently launched one-stop website called stopransomware.gov. Can you describe the services you offer directly to small businesses beyond advice on best practices, and are businesses able to reach out to CISA for help and support if they have questions?
Senator, thank you so much for that question. One of the core elements of CISA's mission is providing proactive assistance to organizations, particularly and including small and medium businesses across the country before an intrusion occurs. Because we know once an intrusion happens, there's already likely going to be some damage done. And so our goal is to get there and deliver guidance, best practices, and services before the ransomware intrusion happens. We offer a variety of services to this end. One option that we offer is self-assessment tools via our stopransomware.gov website, so that an organization that wants to assess their own cybersecurity can download an easy-to-use tool, walk through a process, and understand the work that they have to do. But if an organization also wants CISA's technical help, we offer assistance in identifying cybersecurity vulnerabilities, conducting technical penetration tests, or even red team assessments of an organization's infrastructure, looking at the security of design architectures of a given network, and on down the line. And of course, when an incident does occur, we work closely with our colleagues in federal law enforcement to provide incident response and threat hunting services to determine where the adversary went, what they did, and get them out. All of these services can be easily accessed via the stopransomware.gov portal. They are all, of course, free of charge, and we encourage any organization in the country, public or private, to take advantage of our services, many of which can be delivered through our field personnel assigned throughout the country.
Mr. Downing, cyber threats from China are sadly nothing new, from stealing our intellectual property to hacking records of government employees. The Chinese are clearly comfortable using cyber attacks. On July 19th, the President administration announced that Chinese government-affiliated hackers were responsible for hacking the Microsoft Exchange email server and launching a number of cyber ransomware attacks against U.S.-based companies. So to you, I'm concerned that the Department of Justice's China initiative, a successful initiative to focus resources on combating Chinese espionage from the Trump administration, may not be continued in the Biden administration. Would maintaining the China initiative be helpful in combating cyber offensives from China?
Thank you very much for the question, Senator. I would like to reassure you that indeed the department continues to be keenly focused on the problem of the theft of intellectual property by Chinese actors and by the Chinese government. We have a close partnership between our National Security Division and the Criminal Division where I work, which continues to look at these questions and to aggressively investigate and prosecute individuals who are responsible for them, both inside the United States and outside. We use this, we see this as part of a larger effort that, of course, the Biden administration is very concerned about Chinese overreach and is aggressively looking at these questions as well.
Also, do you, ransomware as a service is basically a form of high-tech organized crime. It's a business model where cyber criminals design a product, ransomware, which can be released to other criminal actors. Some ransomware as a service provider even provide tech help, like black market IT solution providers. So to you, are traditional cyber and organized crime tools available to fight ransomware as a service, or are new tools needed?
Thank you for that question as well. It is true that many of these cyber organizations have organized structures not unlike traditional organized crime. We have aggressively prosecuted them as well using the tools that we have today. I don't have a particular proposal that addresses that point that has been cleared for by the interagency, but we would continue to look at that and work with the committee absolutely on that question.
Does it mean that you have interagency conversations that you're thinking about something along that line if it gets clearance?
We are always looking at all different kinds of tools and the shortcomings to the extent that they have that they exist in our authorities. We have put forward a couple of those kinds of shortcomings for the committee's consideration as part of my statement for the record, and we very much look forward to working with you on that.
Thanks, Senator Grassley. Senator Feinstein.
I'm not a lawyer, But I'm really perplexed by this because what it says to me is that there is a criminal organization operating this process, and we can't do anything about it. If I understand it, in 2020, the FBI received 2,500 complaints relating to ransomware, with adjusted losses of over 29.1 million. This figure probably underestimates the severity of the problem because victims of these attacks are not required to report their data breaches to the FBI. For example, one private security firm reported last year there were nearly 2,400 attacks against United States state and local governments. So they're attacking the government as well. Healthcare facilities and schools alone, with 1,300 companies around the world losing intellectual property or sensitive information to attack. Why can they just exist and we can't do anything about it? What can we do? It seems to me it's a criminal operation.
Thank you for the question, Senator. You described the problem correctly, and that many of the people who attack U.S.-based equities, whether that's small government, municipality government, small businesses, all of your constituents, most of them are overseas. And some of them are in hard-to-reach countries, while others are not in hard-to-reach countries. And I think from the FBI's perspective, this brings the value proposition to focus about our international reach. And Secret Service has a similar international reach. Through the Department of Justice, we have had success in cooperative third-party countries that aren't Russia, right, in terms of safe harboring criminals. And those people have been brought to justice. They may be on criminal charges in a different country. And they
Excuse me, could you just speak to what the FBI advises us to do?
Very simply put, the FBI's advisement is build a relationship with your field office leader as soon as possible for cyber incidents. And then secondly, if you unfortunately become a victim, report those incidents to the FBI or any of our counterparts here, and we will immediately share with the rest of our counterparts. The last thing I would offer is that's very, very important for each of the companies or municipal governments to have well-rehearsed incident response plans, that they understand who to call when they become a victim. They understand the scope of those incident response plans, and to routinely exercise those would be some important messages to share with your constituents.
Thank you.
Senator Graham?
Thank you all. As a matter of fact, I think one of the proposals you have is taking a couple of the bills that we've introduced, Senator Whitehouse and myself, and we'd like to work with you on that. So the bottom line, from the Secret Service point of view, if cryptocurrency didn't exist, would it be harder to do ransomware attacks and get paid for it?
That's an interesting question, sir. It would be harder to facilitate the payment of the attacks. The ransomware attacks themselves would still occur. It would just be through a different payment mechanism.
So if you took cryptocurrency off the table, how would they get paid?
They would utilize other payment structures, regular fiat currency, the traditional financing of crime that has occurred for all existence.
So if they asked for cash, would that be tougher on them?
It would be more difficult for them to facilitate, yes, sir.
Okay. How many ransomware attacks are there every year against Russian businesses?
I don't have that information, sir.
What about Chinese businesses?
Similarly, I'd have to research
What
this.
about Iran?
Yes, same answer, sir.
What about North Korea? Same?
Yes, sir.
I bet you not many. So the point is that we have criminal enterprises interconnected to nation states. Do you agree with that from a Secret Service point of view?
Yes, sir, that's accurate.
If we compiled a terrorist list of state sponsor of terrorism, do we have such a list for state sponsors or safe havens for cyber terrorists?
We have a list of suspects and identified individuals that.
Do you think it would be helpful for the United States to create a list of countries that we believe are aiding and abetting ransomware attacks throughout the free world?
From a law enforcement perspective, we focus more on the individual than the country, sir. I would defer to a larger geopolitical
Would it help
discussion.
the FBI?
Sir, we have a very good handle on what countries are behaving what way.
So we have a list of terrorist organizations, right? Every year, the State Department,
Correct, sir.
in coordination, comes out with a list of terrorist groups. I think we have a list of state sponsor of terrorism every year. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Is that right, Mr. Danning?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
How about let's look at putting a list of state-sponsored or aiding and abetting countries when it comes to ransomware and cyber attacks? Does that make sense?
Perhaps I could jump in on that one. It's something that I don't know that I've thoroughly considered, so I'm not ready to give you a quick answer, but I do think that finding ways to press the countries that are harboring these.
Well, let's make a list of those
important.
countries. Who are they?
Certainly, Russia is at the top of the list. They have been consistently.
So let's stop there. Russia's at the top of the list of 8 ransomware attacks and other cyber crimes. Do you agree with that?
Sir, aiding and abetting has a particular legal definition. I wouldn't say that the government of Russia is behind these attacks. However, we do believe that they are not doing what they could be to suppressing them within their borders.
Why aren't they doing what they could be doing?
There probably are various different reasons for that I could speculate on, including that, as you pointed out,
Have we
sir,
ever seen a connection between the cyber criminals and Russian intelligence agencies?
at times, yes, sir. We have found.
Matter of fact, we found more than one time where the Russian intelligence agency members were actually involved in cyber crimes, right?
That also is true, sir. And
I don't know what their moonlighting policy is, but it seems to me, I don't know what the CIA does in their off time, but I think the point we're trying to make is that deterrence has been lost when it comes to cybercrime, particularly ransomware. Do you all agree?
Sir, I would say we have a significant deterrence. Could we do more? Yes, we would.
Well, is it
need to do
working?
more. It is having some effect, but it is not solving the problem
Are the
alone.
crimes going up or down?
Up, sir.
Dramatically up or slightly up?
Certainly significantly up, yes, sir.
Seems to me that deterrence is not working. From a Secret Service point of view, do you believe the network of laws we have today create enough deterrence in this space?
I believe the network of laws does, sir. I think there needs to be greater enforcement of those laws, greater resources.
So it's an enforcement problem, not legal authority problem?
From my perspective, sir, it's resourcing and enforcement of those laws and better equipping those law enforcement agencies that are tasked with.
So you really don't need much help from us?
We need significant help, sir, in authorities and in.
Well, you just said two different things.
In authorities related to this.
Thank you.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman. First, I'm delighted to be following Senator Graham in the order of questioning because we have a bill with Senator Blumenthal and Senator Tillis, and it looks to me a lot like the Appendix A, Mr. Downing, that you have attached as your proposed legislation, has a Section 2 that is essentially the same as our Section 4, and has a Section 3 that is essentially the same as our Section 6. And I'm wondering if you might sit down with us and come the rest of the way. We're glad you've made these 2 steps. We'd like to understand why you didn't recommend the entire bill. If there are technical changes that you think we should make, then we're eager to work that out. But we think that this is a bill that has bipartisan support that could potentially move by unanimous consent, and we'd like to get this straightened out. Again, our appreciation for copying our 2 sections. Let's try to get together on all of them if we can. Will you do that?
Thank you, Senator. We really appreciate your and Senator Graham's leadership on this.
Senator Blumenthal and Tillis.
And Tillis.
Tillis right here.
Sir. And of course, we would be more than happy to work with your staff on these questions. Absolutely, sir.
Great. So this is kind of a moment of frustration for me as well, because we have known about critical infrastructure as a prime target since I wrote the original Intelligence Committee cyber report probably a decade ago. We've known for years and years and years and years that ransomware was a method for attacking. We have spent billions of dollars, particularly at Homeland Security, on trying to solve the problem of protecting critical infrastructure. And boom, what happens? A bunch of people in a basement someplace are able to take down Colonial Pipeline, a significant piece of colonial infrastructure, with a ransomware attack. That's not a success story. That's a failure story. That's something is wrong in the way we're doing business right now. And it strikes me that the thing that is wrong in the way we're doing business right now is that you can be critical infrastructure in this country, providing essential services to our economy and to our national security, and not have to meet any real standards. I think we've shown in the defense industrial base that with the right kind of pressures, companies can step up and do a better than average job. I think we've shown in the financial sector that with regulators looking over the shoulders of the big banks, they have stepped up and done a better job than average. But here we sit with Colonial Pipeline, with your voluntary standards, the NIST framework and the C3 and your offers, and it obviously failed. I mean, a total faceplant failure. So what I would like to ask is that you and Homeland Security provide to this committee a summary of what Colonial Pipeline accepted by way of all those voluntary offers that you talked about. How vigorous were they about participating in your voluntary programs? How was the response? I think if there is ever a moment where we have a case study of a failure of critical infrastructure from cyber attack, this is it. And I think we're entitled to a bit of a test case here on this voluntary method that we followed and how it's working, because it sure didn't work for Colonial Pipeline, and I'd like to know what they did and did not take up of your series of offers. Can you get that information to us?
Thank you, sir. We'd be glad to provide you with that, and I will note we fully agree that an environment where critical infrastructure that's essential to national critical functions is able to operate insecurely with known security weaknesses, as we know is often the case throughout this country, is untenable. And we as a nation need to act. I will note that in the wake
I'm angry right now, at you because of this situation, but I actually understand that it's not your fault. The fault is here in Congress, where over and over again, groups like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce have come in and said, don't regulate us. We're against all this cyber regulation. We don't want any of this. Make it all go away. We're against this bill. We're against that bill. We're going to tell the leader to, block this legislation if it tries to go forward. And so we now have a situation in which you can have critical infrastructure companies fail at meeting basic standards of cyber hygiene, and we're okay with that. As a legal matter, we're okay with that. We shouldn't be okay with that. We don't have to regulate everybody in the world, but if you're critical infrastructure, we should no longer tolerate this voluntary regime with big companies who know that their infrastructure is critical and who fail.
Yes, sir. Could I ask the chairman for a brief response?
Sure.
Thank you, sir. Senator, as you're aware, in the wake of the Colonial Pipeline intrusion, CISA worked closely with our colleagues at TSA as the security regulator for the pipeline sector to push out 2 security directives, the first of which required reporting of security incidents to CISA, the second of which required entities covered by the directive to undertake mandatory security controls. We view this as a good model to drive the right level of security investment among the most critical entities in this country. We look forward to working with Congress and our partners across the interagency to ensure that we are rapidly raising the bar for cybersecurity across entities that provide national critical functions wherever they may be.
I thank you for that answer, and I would focus particularly on the words "in the wake of."
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. Senator Sass.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all for being here. How large is the universe of known ransomware gangs?
Senator, thank you for the question. The FBI is tracking more than 100 different variants. When I say variants, that would be a brand name such as Sodanakibi, which also is known as Revil. That would be one. But please understand that there are similar actors that cross-cut multiple different variants. But the answer to your question is more than 100 different variants is how many we track.
Thank you for that. Can you size them a little bit for us? And I understand that some of them are duplicate brands, but kind of, issue spot, how big the biggest are, how big are the mediums, what's the barrier to entry below which people are not likely able to have competent technologists to be able to execute an attack?
Senator, before he responds, would each of the witnesses pull the microphone a little closer?
Senator, the answer to your question is we have an entire interagency algorithm that essentially prioritizes from 1 to 101 the level of impact that each variant has had on the United States, its economy, and its other various equities. The largest one that we know of, we would estimate that their revenue from attacks exceeds $200 million, to give you some type of scope on the value proposition. Your last question about barriers to entry, what I would say is that we see affiliates using the ransomware variants that are going to be most effective at compromising potentially vulnerable infrastructure, information technology infrastructure. So certainly happy to follow up on the barriers to entry conversation, but that would be the best answer I can give you today.
And who owns that data set? So I see Senator Cornyn has just arrived. He and I are both active on this issue from the Intel committee side as well. If we wanted a briefing, who is the one person in the U.S. government who's responsible for owning that data?
The roll-up of the data is owned by the FBI through the interagency, but the model was built by the interagency, and every interagency component has input into the model to finalize the prioritization of it.
And returning to Senator Graham's line of questioning, how many of those 100 are Russian allied?
I don't know that answer. Certainly can respond at a later time with a more precise answer. But what I can say is that while the developers may be Russia-based, the affiliates that deploy the ransomware may or may not be Russia-based. So it's a little bit of a complicated question. But if it's okay with you, sir, we can get back to you with a precise number to answer your question properly.
We'd love it. And in addition to whatever print response you want to give us, I think there are a few of us that overlap between this committee and CISI who would love to have an actual briefing on it. Senator Graham has left, but I'd like to pursue the question he asked you about deterrence, because the actual rate of growth is about 300% annually right now. Why do we think any of our deterrence is working? It's not a hostile question at any of you personally, but you all spun this as if there's some success here. It's pretty hard to see that from where we sit.
I can lead the conversation. That my answer from the FBI's perspective would be that we are doing as much as we can with what we have to deter. And I can appreciate why, from your perspective, Senator, that it's not having as significant an impact as you would want. But there are dedicated men and women in the FBI, all the partnerships here, that are devoting hundreds of hours a week to this problem set and helping. Now, if the question is, are we having a large enough impact? I understand that question, but please understand the answer to our question about why we're having an impact is because we have great men and women who are doing this work every day, doing prosecutions, infrastructure disruptions, cryptocurrency seizures, and not just within the FBI, but certainly in the agencies that sit with here today, and the international community, and the intelligence community as well, sir.
So go ahead.
If I may, just to add to that, I think focusing on law enforcement deterrence is an important piece of this puzzle. And I agree with you that, though, it alone is not going to be enough. That's why I think we all need to focus on a whole of government response. That is, that we have our colleagues in the Treasury Department looking at how to enhance our position on the cryptocurrency front. We have our friends in CISA building cyber hygiene to slow down the threat. We have our friends in the State Department who are building international consensus against it and putting pressure on Russia. Yes, investigation and prosecution is an important piece of this, but cannot be the only piece, I think, if we are going to succeed against this threat.
Strongly agree that Putin's cronies who moonlight outside not just the official intel services, but across the oligarchs, like little rent and intel service on the side, clearly they don't fear us. And that deterrent problem is well above y'all's pay grade. Nobody's faulting you here for that. And sir, I recognize you're obviously right that there are a lot of hardworking patriots inside the organization, but that's a different question than whether or not we have the right national strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Sass. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for the work you're doing. When I think back to my early confrontations with this issue as a prosecutor, I always remember a case we had. It was a child porn case, but it involved computers, and it was a little suburb. And the police went to the scene, and they had not been trained, and they pushed some buttons on the computer, and all our evidence disappeared. And now let me bring this to our current situation that we're in. Is so much worse and so much bigger. It is workforce as well as all these other challenges that my colleagues have laid out. And maybe the numbers I have, an estimated 3.5 million cybersecurity jobs will be available but unfilled in 2021. Approximately 1 in 3 cybersecurity jobs in the federal level going unfilled. Talk to me about people from the private sector, perhaps. Senator Thune and I had a bill on this to get it to come here. So we are as sophisticated as the bad guys trying to, ransom and do all kinds of bad stuff to disrupt our critical infrastructure. How are we going to get the people in, and what should we do to help?
Senator, thank you for that question. I'll turn it over to Mr. Goldstein to partner on this answer. I do want to address your opening statement, though, related to state and local capabilities. As has been stated multiple times, this is a whole-of-government approach. Mm-hmm. The Secret Service has the National Computer Forensics Institute that has trained and equipped more than 16,000 state, local, territorial, tribal officers, as well as judges and prosecutors. Mm-hmm. We train more than 3,000 a year, and these really are the first line of defense. I think this goes to Senator Feinstein's questions about what people can do to be more resilient. My colleague, Mr. Vorndran, has mentioned relationships. This is where the relationship forms with those that you know in your community, your constituents, to have that level of trust, that level of communication, to be the first responder in these types of incidents. That institution, as you may be aware, is due to sunset in 22. Mm-hmm. We greatly appreciate Congress's support for allowing us to train as many as we have, but we need to seek reauthorization, as well as growth, not only domestically but internationally for that facility to, as you said, make sure we're better prepared on the state and local level.
Okay. And then if we could get to the question of the unfilled jobs and how we're going to get people into this area, young people and the like, with a call to service, I hope. Mr. Goldstein.
Absolutely. Senator, thank you for calling out this critical question. There is no bigger challenge facing the future of our nation's cybersecurity than building a deep and diverse workforce to meet the threats we are facing now and facing tomorrow. At CISA, we're looking at this as really having 3 components. The first is how do we build cybersecurity and STEM education into our K-12 students today? At CISA, we have a grant program where we provide cybersecurity curriculum and training to K-12 teachers across the country. Obviously, that is a large population. We need to scale and do more. So the first question is, how do we ensure that across elementary, middle, and high schools across this country, our students are learning, first and foremost, the importance of cybersecurity, and then the basic skills to pursue this as an avocation from a very young age. That will require some very fundamental changes in how we think about educating our children in this country. The second is, how do we resource those leaving secondary education, going to 2-year institutions, HBCUs, trade schools, all the way to 4-year universities, ensuring that those universities have the programs where they are turning out graduates that are able to take jobs at the leading cybersecurity entities in our country, whether Secret Service, CISA, or the FBI, or the private sector, because frankly, we are all in the same fight here. And here, CISA, again, provides curriculum and training to a select group of entities largely serving underserved communities. We need to do more there. The third piece is, how do we make it easier to enter public service as a cybersecurity practitioner? The cybersecurity market today is extraordinarily competitive, and we need an urgent call to action to make sure that the best and brightest are joining our agencies to help defend our country against these threats.
Got it. I think some of our model is people stay forever in the government, and we may have a situation where we have a call to action to come to our government for a while. Maybe they go somewhere else after that, but we're just going to fall behind if we can't get people to do it. Did you want to add anything, Mr. Vordran?
Senator, very briefly, just rough numbers. A computer scientist graduating college with a 4-year bachelor's degree can earn about $100,000. The entry position, certainly within the Department of Justice, is about $63,000. We can't incentivize that year over year right now. So just to highlight the focus of your concern and the recruiting retention problem, it is a significant barrier.
Mm-hmm. Senator Thune and I had a bill a few years ago to allow people to go into certain areas. You have all kinds of issues, especially with the FBI, with then classified private sector people coming in. But I think we should revisit that for certain positions, but it is, we've got to figure this out so we get the people. And I have some other questions, I'm out of time, about small businesses with the 51% not being able to have any resources to cybersecurity themselves and how we're going to build that up. But I can ask that on the record, or maybe my colleagues will. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Klobuchar. Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. Mr. Sheridan, I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to Senator Graham's question. You were talking about authorities and other. Read that quickly.
Thank you very much, Senator. So regards to authorities, as I mentioned, our National Computer Forensics Institute reauthorization is extremely important, not just for us, but for the whole of government approach. As well, our authorities within the Secret Service related to investigations specifically for statutory authority on money laundering, structured payments, and unlicensed money transmitters would be very beneficial for us to strengthen our investigative mission.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Goldstein, in my office, I was a part of a practice that did ethical hack testing at Price Waterhouse back in the late 90s and early 2000s and followed this pretty closely. In my office, I have Hacking for Dummies, which is a great book, and every business should read it and understand how vulnerable they are. I believe that businesses, a part of what we're doing here is to provide you all with better tools to seek out bad actors and hold them accountable. But businesses have benefited mightily from the internet and electronic systems. They need to harden their systems the way that they harden their physical presences with alarm systems, burglar bars, whatever it takes to secure a physical premise. So I think one thing that we have to do is make it very clear to business that we alone, the federal government or the whole of government, are not responsible for securing their business enterprise. We're there when somebody breaks in to bring them to justice. But is it still the case that the vast majority of these hacks are attributed to human error, that there's a click on a link? Is that still the case in your research, that we've got to better educate people that they're the weak link in most of these successful hack events?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. It is certainly still the case that particularly with ransomware intrusions, most of the events that we are seeing are attributable to known security weaknesses. So it might be the case that an employee clicks on a phishing link. It might also be the case, as has been reported publicly with Colonial Pipeline, that the adversary exploited a legacy remote access device that was using a known password. And so certainly this is why we are so focused on driving adoption of these basic practices, because we know that these can demonstrably reduce the likelihood that a business will be exploited by a ransomware intrusion.
Why shouldn't we? I fall short of mandating what the private sector does and to provide them best practices, but why shouldn't we, as a matter of federal policy, require everyone who does business with the federal government to adopt and implement these practices as a price of admission for doing business with the federal government?
That's a great question, sir. So President Biden's cybersecurity executive order issued earlier this year required CISA to work with our partners in government to do exactly that, to prescribe new contract clauses that will be adopted into federal acquisition law and will provide a floor for the kinds of security controls that we expect to see from federal
The administration already has that authority. Congress doesn't need to do anything more to push the point.
My understanding, sir, is that today we can do what we need to do in that space. That's correct.
Mr. Vorndran, what about the concept of, I think maybe Senator Whitehouse and Daines have introduced the concept of a hackback to basically allow private sector to go after those who are holding them or requesting ransom. What's the department's opinion about really encouraging businesses to go back after these people, hack back.
You want me to take it? Senator, do you mind if I defer that question to the department? Thank you.
Sir, on the hackback question, the department has long held the position that it is ill-advised to encourage or permit private sector people to hack back. A couple of reasons. First, there's a real risk to innocent users. Very often the infrastructure that's involved is not the offenders that they're going after, but instead innocent third parties. Second, there is a real problem with the interference with ongoing criminal or intelligence investigations when you have private sector people monkeying around in these groups and these organizations. And third, very often at the early stages of an investigation, we don't know who's behind it. And so if you happen to be hacking back from, let's say, a film company that is invaded, and it turns out later that it's North Korea, as has happened, that's a particularly sensitive situation where you want to make sure that the government actors are the ones in charge of how we are going to take those steps and not have it be done by private sector people who are not in a position to understand the full picture or the geopolitical situation. So our longstanding position has been that is not a helpful road to go down. Instead, report to us, report to the FBI. We can have an effect and an impact, and that's the better approach.
Thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator Tillis. Senator Rono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the panel, you all agreed that there is a causal relationship between the growth in cryptocurrencies helping to drive the increase in ransomware attacks. I think that you generally agreed yes. We're not quite sure what to do about it. But aside from things like considering the U.S. banning cryptocurrencies, what about should we make ransomware payments illegal? Anybody want to answer that?
Senator, thank you for the question. It's our opinion that banning ransomware payments is not the road to go down, and there's really a prime reason for that. Right now, what was shared in the opening remarks is that ransomware has a single extortion model. Essentially, we would hold your data ransom until you pay for that data. Well, in the very recent past, actors have moved to a double extortion model. First, they exfil data and threaten to leak it on a Tor site for sensitive information. The second prong of the extortion is the ransom for the encrypted data. It would be our opinion that if we ban ransom payments, now you're putting U.S. companies in a position to face yet another extortion, which is being blackmailed for paying the ransom and not sharing that with authorities. And so it's a really complicated conversation, but it's our position that banning ransom payments is not the road to go down.
If I could add, ma'am, as well,
yes,
reporting is one of our biggest challenges related to this.
I'm sorry, what is?
Reporting, as was
yes.
stated by several of my colleagues, banning the payments would further push any reporting to law enforcement into obscurity and make it virtually impossible for us to have that relationship.
So this is quite the conundrum for all of us. And I note that we're going to need a workforce that is very attuned to the need for to have an understanding of cybersecurity issues and STEM backgrounds. And you noted, I think it's Mr. Downing, that we need a whole of government response. That means that we should be across departments. Does that include the Department of Education? Because I know that Mr. Goldstein said that we need to really have curriculum within our elementary schools that focuses on STEM and that provides an understanding of cybersecurity. So is the Department of Education involved in this whole of government approach that you all talked about?
Thank you, ma'am. Yes, absolutely. So CISA works very closely with our colleagues at Education, as well as at the National Science Foundation and other agencies to make sure that our partners in government with a role in promoting a curriculum that meets the challenges of today and tomorrow are on board. And so this is really a whole of government effort where our goal is to make sure that those individuals in school today are prepared to take on the jobs that will need them to face this challenge going forward.
So is this kind of curriculum already in our elementary public schools?
That's correct in some cases. Certainly, it is not ubiquitous across the country yet, but this is part of course, a broad focus on STEM education. Part of ensuring that children in school in this country are focusing on STEM education is the cybersecurity aspect of that challenge, and so making sure that we are encouraging both STEM as a basic focus and then cybersecurity as an aspect thereof will be critical going forward.
I actually would like to see some an actual curriculum in our elementary schools that focuses on STEM. What about engaging with our allies? Because it's not just the U.S. government, whole of government, but we really need to engage with our allies in how to prevent these kinds of crimes from occurring. So how are we doing on that score?
Sure. I'll offer a first thought and then I'll hand it off to my colleagues. From our perspective at CISA, we work very closely with international computer emergency response teams, or CERTs, who are the network defenders globally to protect their country's private and public networks. And we share information with them continuously on new ransomware threats that we can then share to help protect businesses and government networks in our country.
Go ahead.
If I may, there are a number, you're exactly right that international collaboration is critical to what we do, and there are a number of factors that are in play here. We strongly support, for example, the Convention on Cybercrime to encourage appropriate laws around the world, and that's been building over the years. Partnerships with foreign law enforcement agencies are critical. The Secret Service and the FBI have personnel stationed in foreign countries with international agencies like Europol with some very effective results. And thirdly, for the Department of Justice, we have a program called the ICHIPS, the International Computer Hacking and Intellectual Property Coordinators, stationed in various countries. We find that having prosecutors in foreign countries also helps to build those relationships, which have proven to be so effective when we've done takedowns like the NetWalker and Emotet ones that I mentioned earlier. It's that international collaboration that is key to many of the successes that we've had.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cornyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this very important hearing. I think we're suffering from many of the same silos we identified on 9/11, where we find that there's a number of different parts of the federal government that are dealing with the same problem in different ways. And we're dependent on the executive branch, depending on from administration to administration, to come up with a coherent strategy, which uses the all-of-government approach that Mr. Downing and others have advocated. But let me start with the very basic question. When somebody gets hacked, should they be required to notify the federal government, Mr. Goldstein, perhaps CISA, or the FBI?
Certainly. So our view is that any efforts to increase the volume of incident reporting to CISA and to be shared with our partners in federal law enforcement is absolutely essential. Absent this reporting, we are unable to offer assistance. We are unable to address many of the questions that you and your colleagues have raised today to understand the breadth and scope of the problem, and we're unable to develop information that we can share effectively to prevent other intrusions. So certainly steps taken to increase reporting across the country will be highly beneficial. We look forward to working with Congress towards that important goal.
Mr. Fordray.
Senator, thank you for the question. If I can just amplify Mr. Goldstein's remarks, as is memorialized in Mr. Downing's statement for the record and my statement for the record, we are very significant advocates for mandatory breach reporting. There's really three reasons for that, right? We need sufficient information about tactical information, ransom requested, where to pay the ransom, how to contact the actors. The information must be shared promptly so that we can respond accordingly. And then there needs to be a requirement to immediately share across the interagency. Admittedly, sir, that already happens today, but anything we can collectively do to increase reporting is going to be very helpful in this problem area. Our estimates are that between 25 and 30% of incidents get reported to federal law enforcement at this time.
Well, I know there are at least two bills that are currently out there, one from the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, a bipartisan bill, Senator Portman, Senator Peters, and then there's also an Intel Committee bill that Senator Warner and a number of us are working on to require that, because it seems like in the past we've relied on the business community, for example, to make a report, and perhaps they feel like because of reputational considerations or some others, they may just want to not report it. And because once it gets into the public domain, then maybe people don't feel comfortable doing business with them, or maybe they go to a competitor or the like. But it strikes me as absolutely critical, and I'm glad to hear your answer that we get the universe of the universal picture, and then to give you and other authorities the opportunity to deal with it. There ought to be some sort of confidential means to do that, and one that perhaps provides some liability protection, much as we've done in the past with some of the programs through the National Security Agency when it comes to collecting information from phone companies and the like. How big a problem is attribution, Mr. Vordendran?
Senator, that's an excellent question. The response to your question is it's very challenging, especially in the criminal cyber element, moved away sometimes from the nation-state cyber element, but in the criminal cyber element is extremely challenging to gain attribution down to a keyboard or an actor behind a keyboard. I would estimate that about half of our cases don't have accurate attribution because of the complexity involved.
And that's part of the tradecraft of the cyber offender, correct? Hiding their identity?
Yes, sir. I mean, it's very easy to masquerade as a Mandarin keyboard in Brazil that would potentially probe a network. And the person behind that keyboard may or may not speak Mandarin.
I agree with you and Mr. Downing that the law enforcement model is an important component, but only a component of what our response should be. Indeed, after the 2016 Russian interference and cyber attacks on the DNC server and leaking that to General Nakasone and the folks out at Cyber Command and NSA undertook a way to try to protect our voting systems in 2018, and we had remarkably improved protection of our voting systems. So we know that we have the capability to do it. We just need to figure out how to come up with a strategy, perhaps something like we did on Congress passed 5G and beyond, which basically mandated that the executive branch come up with a comprehensive strategy working with Congress, because frankly, we're so, as I mentioned at the beginning, siloed here. We've got different committees of different jurisdiction and different levels of information about these issues and different perspectives, depending on if you're the Judiciary Committee focusing on law enforcement as opposed to maybe the Intel Committee looking at the espionage threat, or the Governmental Affairs Committee looking at some other aspect of it. So having a plan, I think, is really important, because right now, and notwithstanding our outstanding capabilities, I think we're getting our lunch eaten on a regular basis, and we've got to up our game. That's not a comment on what you do or the people that work with you. I think it's up to Congress and the policymakers to come up with a policy that you can then implement to do the job that you're trained to do and that you're trying to do every day. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Cornyn and Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and I want to join in thanking you and the ranking member for this hearing, and thank you, all the law enforcement members of this panel. You have definitely upped your game. There's no question about your recent record, and I'm sure it reflects long-standing work on putting together the infrastructure that's necessary to do that law enforcement, and the skills and the equipment and so forth. As has been mentioned, Senators Whitehouse, Graham, Tillis, and I have a measure that we've introduced, the International Cybercrime Prevent Act, which is intended to provide you with more tools, and maybe mandatory reporting ought to be one of them. A number of our colleagues have asked for liability protections in connection with that reporting, and I would welcome the opportunity to consult with you as to ways there may be to protect the confidentiality of information that is provided in the course of reporting, because I think that's one of the concerns that may discourage more reporting. Some of us come from a hearing in the Commerce Committee where I asked the head of TSA about reporting, and he testified that there is reluctance because of the fear of publicity. But that is a common thread in law enforcement, as you well know, that prevents reporting of rape. It prevents reporting by seniors about financial crimes. It prevents all kinds of reporting. So we need to overcome that obstacle. I want to ask about the harboring of these cyber criminals in Russia and China. I was very impressed and appreciated President Biden raising this issue in his meeting with Vladimir Putin. The Russian government's hacking and its providing safe haven to criminal elements that in turn have attacked us. And he was very dramatic in his telling Russia, according to the readout of the recent Biden call with Putin this month, that we will take, quote, any action necessary to defend our people and our critical infrastructure. Have you seen any change in the amount or severity of cybercrime from Russia in this last month?
Perhaps I could take that one, Senator. I don't believe there has been a measurable drop. No, I don't think that is a change.
So essentially, there's no evidence that Putin is heeding this warning as yet, correct?
I think that's fair, yes.
How about on the part of China? Is it getting the...
With respect to China, that's a complex situation. We continue to press on that issue from the Department of Justice's perspective in investigating and prosecuting those crimes aggressively.
Well, let me be somewhat simplistic. What I'm hearing is that Russia and China essentially are taking no real action in cracking down on these criminal gangs or the malicious cyber attacks that make us the target.
Senator,
correct?
I would just add that, as my colleague noted, we believe that only about a quarter of ransomware intrusions are actually reported. And so the question of are we seeing a change in trend is a very hard one to answer. It certainly could be the case that some ransomware actors have changed behavior for a variety of reasons. We simply don't have the data to be able to answer that question with any level of authority.
Okay, but we have to act on the basis of what we know, not what we don't know. And from what we know, and you have the best knowledge in the business, there's been no perceptible change in behavior on the part of either China or Russia in cracking down on these criminal actors.
Based upon available data, we have not seen a change in the trend line of ransomware intrusions overall.
And the available data that you'd need would be more reporting of these attacks?
That's correct, sir.
Do you have a way of knowing about these attacks without their being reported?
We do not, sir, not reliably.
Is there conceivably a way technologically to know?
So I defer to my colleagues in law enforcement if they have any methods. Like reference from our point of view, hearing from the victims will be the most authoritative way to understand the breadth of these intrusions.
And only a quarter of them are telling you when they are victims.
And again, sir, that's a rough estimate since we don't know the incidents that we are not hearing about.
You don't know what you don't know, but I guess what I'm taking away from what I've heard from you and what I've heard in the Commerce Committee, the companies of America, our corporate sector, really is failing in its responsibility to protect our national security by refusing to report these instances of cyber attacks. Am I overstating it?
In this case, sir, it truly needs to be a whole-of-nation effort with government and industry working together around this shared challenge. And the more the companies report their intrusions to the government, the better a job we can do in managing this risk.
I interpret that as a yes. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ransomware attacks have become more and more common and more dangerous. In May of this year, hackers based in Russia shut down Colonial Pipeline, a pipeline that carries gasoline to the southeastern United States. And what did the Biden administration do? Next to nothing. The administration sat around as gas lines formed up and down the eastern seaboard, And the White House Deputy National Security Advisor tried to absolve the Biden administration, tried to absolve the president from any responsibility whatsoever, saying, quote, Colonial is a private company and will defer information regarding their decision on paying a ransom to them. Well, later, after Colonial paid a $4.4 million ransom, President Biden decided to reward Russia for allowing this hack. He green-lighted the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, a natural gas pipeline from Russia to Germany that will put billions of dollars in the pockets of Vladimir Putin. And then he sat down with Putin and told him that only certain parts of America's critical infrastructure should be off limits. He specified 16 parts that were off limits. Call me crazy, I think all of our critical infrastructure should be off limits to Russian hacking. And when the president enumerates 16 that matter, that is an invitation to hack every other part of our infrastructure. Mr. Downing, does paying ransom encourage more ransomware attacks?
I think it's fair to say that when criminals profit, they draw more criminals into that space. And so the paying of ransoms is certainly one thing that fuels the increase of ransomware attacks that we've seen.
And does telling Putin that only certain parts of our infrastructure are off limits, does that act like the Colonial Pipeline attack?
I would have to say that the president's communications with Putin are outside of my purview. However, I can assure you that we are continuing to press for results, and we are not waiting around from a law enforcement perspective to see what would happen there. We are pursuing the cases and the investigations and the activities that we would in order to do the very best that we can to drive deterrence and to arrest and disrupt these operations.
Mr. Goldstein, is attacking a pipeline a new concept, or have we seen this before?
Senator, the attack on Colonial Pipeline is the first incident that we have certainly seen in this country of an intrusion causing a disruption to pipeline infrastructure.
But your organization just recently issued a release stating that between 2011 and 2013, Chinese state-sponsored actors targeted 23 U.S. natural gas pipeline operators. Is that right?
That's correct, sir. That refers to targeting rather than an intrusion resulting in an actual disruption.
But the idea that malevolent actors would go after infrastructure like pipelines, that is a threat we've been aware of for some time.
That's correct, Senator.
China has repeatedly used ransomware and cyber attacks to harm America. Not only has it attacked pipelines in an effort to cause physical damage, but just this year, hackers affiliated with the Chinese government attacked tens of thousands of computers across tens of thousands of organizations, including a significant number of small businesses, towns, cities, and local governments. Once again, unfortunately, the Biden administration responded to extreme threats with extreme weakness. The Biden administration has not imposed any sanctions on China. Instead, the administration announced that it is dropping criminal cases against 5 Chinese scientists who, with the help of consular officials, hid their affiliations with China's military in order to infiltrate our nation. Mr. Downing, why is this administration refusing to prosecute Chinese scientists who lied about their ties to the Chinese military in order to come to this country and gain access to information?
Senator, thank you for the question. I would have to say that from my position in the criminal division, I am not responsible for those decisions. However, it is something that I'd be happy to take back and get you an answer for.
And let me ask anyone on the panel, do you have an answer as to why the administration has not sanctioned China for repeated cyber attacks over and over and over again against the United States? Well, I think that's a question that administration should answer, and showing weakness to China and weakness to Russia only invites more aggression and more cyber attacks attacking our nation. Thank you.
Senator Ossoff?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our panelists. One of the benefits of bringing a whole of government approach to a national security issue such as this is that it can bring the full force of the U.S. government. One of the risks is jurisdictional ambiguity, a lack of a clear chain of command and organizational responsibility. So what I'd like to ask first is for each of you, and forgive me, I can't see how you're arrayed beneath the dais, but beginning with you, Mr. Downing, and then proceeding sequentially, to identify what it is that your agency, your component, has lead responsibility for in preventing and responding to ransomware attacks that none of the other components or agencies represented here has lead responsibility for. What are you uniquely responsible for ensuring happens and gets done to protect our cybersecurity?
Thank you very much for the question, Senator. At the Department of Justice, we have two divisions that are responsible in part for responding to the ransomware attacks. My division, the criminal division, is responsible for those attacks that are identified as being from criminal actors. And so we have taken the lead on a very large number of the recent ransomware attacks. We bring charges, we make charging decisions, we work on the legal side to make sure that the law enforcement agencies are able to obtain the evidence that they need, extraditions through our Office of International Affairs in order to get them back to the United States. My colleagues in the National Security Division support that work through a lot of different means related to national security authorities. However, when the actors responsible are nation states or proxies for nation states, then they would have the key role in all of the same ways that I mentioned: gathering evidence, bringing charges, and seeing those charges through to court.
Thank you. Mr. Vorndran, please.
Thank you for the question, Senator. In response to your question, we would reference Presidential Policy Directive 41 from 2016. That was the first ever national policy on this topic and sought to define a significant cyber incident and answer your exact question, who's in charge. Instead of naming a single agency, it recognized shared responsibility across the United States government, and it defined threat response as involving investigation, attribution, and threat pursuit, and named the Department of Justice acting through the FBI and the National Cyber Investigative Joint Task Force as the lead agency for this line of effort during a significant incident. I'll certainly let Mr. Goldstein reference CISA's role. ODNI has a role in PPD 41, but I think another key takeaway.
I appreciate there's a broad spectrum of responsibilities here. My question is what is FBI's role that is distinct from every other agency represented here today? What do you do and your personnel do that nobody else does?
In PPD 41, investigate, attribute, threat pursuit for a ransomware incident.
Thank you, Mr. Vorndran. Mr. Goldstein, please.
Thank you, Senator. CISA is uniquely focused on the cyber defense mission. In the context of incident response, we are focused exclusively on mitigating impacts to the victim and deriving network defense information that we can share with others. But we also focused significantly on what we would call left of boom, focusing on sharing information and providing services to reduce the prevalence and impact of cybersecurity intrusions before they occur for critical infrastructure, small, medium businesses, and SLTT partners across the country.
Understand. So is it fair to say that prevention and adaptation, is that what you're suggesting is your unique institutional role at CISA?
I would frame it, Senator, as prevention, resilience, and then in the context of an incident, mitigation.
Mr. Sheridan.
Thank you, Senator. The Secret Service is focused on protecting the nation's financial infrastructure and financial payment systems.
Well, you all have some responsibility for protecting those aspects of critical infrastructure, correct? My question is, what does the U.S. Secret Service lead on, or what operations do you conduct? What mission do you execute that is distinct from the other missions represented by your colleagues at other agencies?
Our distinction is that our statutory authority is focused on financial payment systems, the nation's financial infrastructure, and I think the distinction of trying to make singular entities is diluting the concept about this being a team sport. There is necessary overlap to provide defense in depth to ensure there's not a single point of failure that the adversary can exploit. We do have some overlapping authorities. The Secret Service focuses on financial payment systems and the nation's financial infrastructure, which does have some shared responsibility, but we are the leading agency related to those investigations.
Thank you, Mr. Sheridan. No doubt collaboration is important, so is clarity of purpose. And in the aftermath of recent significant cybersecurity failures, what I'm trying to establish is where there is sufficient clarity. Mr. Goldstein, would you please comment on how various sectors across the U.S. private and public sectors, so for example, the defense industrial base, the financial services industry, local governmental entities, the energy sector as represented, for example, by the recent Colonial Pipeline breach, how would you rank or contrast their respective levels of appropriate investment, preparation, and whether they engage in the kind of prudent and vigilant and disciplined and well-resourced cybersecurity efforts necessary to protect their networks?
Thank you, Senator. I'll start by just noting that apart from the agencies participating here today, there are a variety of other agencies across the federal government called sector risk management agencies that have unique expertise in promoting prudent risk management, both cyber and otherwise, across sectors of the U.S. economy that do play a critical role in this team sport, as Mr. Sheridan noted. Across sectors, there is certainly significant divergence in cybersecurity maturity, both across sectors, but also within sectors. Certainly, we have cybersecurity measures and best practices in the financial sector, the defense industrial base, and the energy sector. That is not to say, of course, that every entity in those sectors is equally or even appropriately secure. And so we certainly need to focus on each sector and really shift our focus as well on national critical functions, because we know that a function upon which Americans depend, such as keeping the lights on, that relies not only on the energy utilities, but also the cross-sector entities upon which they depend. And so by looking at a functional approach, we can begin to ensure that these services that we all rely on remain resilient and secure against cyber intrusions.
Thank you, Mr. Goldstein. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. And Senator, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to each of you. You know, it's been so interesting. We're having a pipeline cybersecurity hearing in Commerce this morning, so this is our focus today. Director Sheridan, I'd like to come to you. We hear all this information, conflicting things between cryptocurrencies and cyber attacks, and some people say cryptocurrency is used because it's less traceable. Others say, well, it always leaves a digital trail, but that law enforcement is not using blockchain or other technologies that would work through this. And we've recently started a financial innovation caucus. So I'd love to hear from you on this. With cryptocurrency, does it make it harder for tracing ransomware attacks?
So the interesting contradiction is that it actually makes it somewhat easier because there, as you said, there is a digital trail. Now, there are privacy coins and anonymizing techniques such as chain swapping, chain hopping, peel chain methodologies, and various technological approaches that can add layers to that digital trail. In that sense, it makes it more difficult. But if I handed you a $5 bill and asked you where it's been, it would be almost impossible to tell. If I handed you a Bitcoin wallet address, we would be able to tell what's gone in and what's gone out because of the digital evidence. So it is possible to trace. To your point, we do need to expand our resources related to that. We have a very strong workforce, a very technically capable workforce of computer scientists, blockchain analysts, crypto tracers, but we need more of them. We need to get better equipped, better trained, and expand our presence domestically and internationally related to those capabilities.
Do you have a timeline for moving forward with having being able to set some standards? Have you all looked at what this would take? What will it take as far as man hours, personnel, training?
We do have a very detailed projection in terms of timeline, resources, and budget for our ransomware approach as it relates to cryptocurrency and other digital monies.
Is that information you could share with us, with the committee?
Yes, ma'am.
I think that would be helpful. Director Vondran, let me ask you, has the FBI looked into using new technologies in blockchain to track and remediate some of the ransomware attacks and transactions?
Thank you for the question, Senator. To amplify what Jeremy Sheridan said, we use the blockchain daily across the organization to trace Bitcoin. And I think Mr. Sheridan's comments are spot on that in certain cases, it actually makes the tracing easier. In certain cases, it makes it more challenging. And his reference to a $5 bill and understanding its traceability is a very good analogy. But we have many FBI agents, FBI analysts, data operations specialists, and other types of personnel in the organization that use the blockchain on a daily basis.
You know, General Dowling, let me come to you with this. Bulletproof hosters. And hearing about these and the data centers and the companies that allow ransomware to be transacted on their servers. And of course, this is something that is troubling, that they're setting up overseas and largely outside of U.S. law. Are there more steps that you all can take to better track and shut down these bulletproof hosting operations, at least domestically?
Thank you for the question. Effective response to the ransomware problem, we need to look at all parts of the ecosystem. And bulletproof hosting is is one of those parts. We have at times brought criminal prosecutions against the owners of these kinds of bulletproof hosters where we can show that they are well aware that they are contributing to criminal activity. But it is, like many parts of this problem, made more difficult by the international side of it. These actors are very often overseas, and so we have to take steps to build our international partnerships in order to arrest them. Those are things we are focused on, though, and we will continue to be as part of the overall response to the ransomware threat.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator. Senator Cotton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Vorndrand. Thank you. Both Russia and China have tried to undermine multiple American industries through sabotage and intellectual property theft. American agriculture is no exception. In just the last few years, we've seen several high-profile examples of this. In 2016, Chinese researchers were sentenced to federal prison for attempting to steal patented corn seeds and trade secrets from American farms. In 2018, Chinese researchers were sentenced to federal prison for trying to steal trade secrets from the USDA's Dell bumpers, National Rice Research Center, and from American biotech company. In 2019, a Chinese national was indicted on economic espionage charges when he stole a copy of a proprietary algorithm for optimizing agricultural productivity for farmers. This has happened in my home state. There's open indictments against Chinese nationals for trying to steal rice-related intellectual property. I assume they have absconded back to mainland China by now. The efforts aren't limited to espionage. Just a few weeks ago, a Russian-linked group launched cyber attacks against JBS, one of the largest meat packers in the United States. The ransomware attack temporarily shut down JBS's cattle slaughtering and resulted in JBS paying a Bitcoin ransom of almost $11 million. These type of attacks and espionage against agriculture don't just threaten the livelihoods of American farmers and companies, they also threaten our food supply chain. Do you agree that American agriculture is a target for foreign cyber actors who are looking for opportunities to attack?
Senator, thanks for the question. The answer to your question is yes, we believe they are a target, but we believe everybody is a target. Whoever has a vulnerability, there is an adversary out there that will try to exploit it for any number of reasons. Number one reason, financial gain.
Thank you. Mr. Goldstein, do you agree that American agriculture is a target for attack?
As my colleague noted, absolutely, but for the same reasons as noted, organizations that are vulnerable and can be exploited for profit are certainly a target for these adversaries.
Mr. Downing, I wasn't going to ask you this question, but you committed a cardinal sin of a witness, eagerly nodding your head, directing fire in your way. So now I'll say, do you agree as well?
Yes, no, I think that's exactly right. The section I supervise was part of some of those prosecutions, and we have had some successes in bringing Chinese actors to justice in the United States courts.
Since I'm with you, Mr. Downing, then, would you agree that it would improve the security of American agriculture if the industry and the regulators and government had better and faster information about the threats that they might face from foreign cyber actors?
Yes, as we've said repeatedly today, reporting from victims is critical. We strongly support the idea that Congress take up this issue and to pass legislation that would require reporting of a variety of different kinds of attacks, particularly ransomware, of course, the subject of this issue, but also attacks on our critical infrastructures and other high-risk attacks that would affect especially a wider circle other than just the victim.
I'm glad to hear you say that you think Congress should take up legislation, because I have a bill that would do just that. My Agricultural Intelligence Measures Act would ensure the USDA has streamlined access to threat information relevant to key players in American agriculture. I think it's time that we step up and protect America's farmers and ranchers from the foreign threats that seek to destroy our food supply chain. Let me turn to a topic in my time left that I know that Senator Klobuchar raised, which is cyber talent recruiting. I think Mr. Vorndran, I'll address this to you as well. You have two types of positions at the FBI, is my understanding, computer scientists and forensic examiners that are especially important for responding to cyber attacks and investigating to hunt for cyber criminals who committed them. Cyber threats are constantly evolving, of course, and therefore our response to those threats also requires to have tech talent that is on the cutting edge. Is that right?
Yes, Senator, that is accurate.
And you have to compete for those folks with some pretty big companies that can pay pretty generous. Microsoft, Oracle, Facebook, and innumerable startups. That's not even mentioning other top cybersecurity companies. Do you find that the high demand for the country's best graduates in science, technology, engineering, math, and related fields makes it harder to recruit and retain some of the best cyber experts?
Senator, we have an amazing workforce, and I can't underscore that enough. People dedicated to the mission and protection of this country. But to your question, yes, sir, it is hard to recruit the number of people that we need with those skill sets.
So my office has been in touch with the FBI on this issue, and I do respect greatly the workforce you have. I do think there are some things, though, that we could do to provide the FBI more tools to get the very best talent in our country and to retain them as well. I would liken some of the challenges that you might face to stuff I've heard on the Armed Services Committee from Air Force pilots who leave the Air Force not because they can make, or not only because they can make more pay in the private sector, but because they're not getting to do enough of what they joined the Air Force to do, to fly high-performance aircraft to focus on bad guys. The government's never going to be able to pay as much as the airlines pay, and I suspect the Department of Justice is never going to be able to pay as much as Silicon Valley pays. But we want to give you every tool possible in the toolkit to make sure that we have the very best people working on this problem and that they are fulfilled and rewarded in their job and want to make it a long-term proposition, if not a career. My time's expired.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. Thanks to the witnesses for joining us today. While we cannot stop ransomware attacks completely, we can certainly be better prepared. We learned today that preventive measures are more cost-effective and have greater impact on stemming the rise of these attacks than just increased enforcement alone. We also learned how critical information sharing is between private and public sectors across government agencies. What struck me about this hearing was there was a general bipartisan consensus on this side of the table. And I like that. And I think that's a positive thing. And I hope it leads, and I think it will, to specific legislation to deal with this. There was one dissenting voice who blamed the Biden administration for the problems of Colonial Pipeline and such. I think fairness requires us to be candid about other aspects of previous administrations, such as solar wind, which was a massive breach that affected thousands of companies and the U.S. government. It was discovered not by the U.S. Cyber Command, but by another private entity, I understand, named FireEye. It's an indication that we can and should strive to do better. It also is important to note that it wasn't until this administration in April made the public declaration connecting the Russians to SolarWind that that statement became accepted. I think that's an indication of the intent of this administration, I hope every administration, to keep America safe. We need to view this problem with a sense of urgency. I think that the legislation which you proposed, Mr. Downing, is a beginning of a conversation with the administration on doing this. And as you noticed from Senator Whitehouse, Graham, Tillis, and Blumenthal, they're anxious to move this forward. and we want this committee to facilitate that conversation. The hearing record will remain open for 1 week for statements. Questions for the record may be submitted by 5 p.m. on Tuesday, August 3rd. I thank the witnesses again for being here, and the hearing is adjourned.